The year is 1600. You are standing in Rome, not the Rome of postcards, not the Rome of marble fountains and sweeping piazzas. This Rome smells of sewage and animal waste. The streets are narrow, unpaved, dangerous after dark. Ancient ruins, the Colosseum, the Forum, stand half buried in dirt, used as quarries or converted into stables. The population has collapsed to barely 100,000 people. Malaria kills thousands every summer. The city that once ruled the world looks like it has given up. By 1700, it will be the most beautiful city on earth. This is how it happened. To understand what Rome was about to become, you need to understand the crisis that made it necessary. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther had nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg. What followed shattered the Christian world. By 1600, half of Europe had abandoned the Catholic Church. England was Protestant. Much of Germany was Protestant. Scandinavia was Protestant. The institution that had defined Western civilization for 1,000 years was fighting for its survival. The Catholic Church's response was the Counter-Reformation, and its most powerful weapon was not argument. It was not theology, it was beauty. If the Church could make Rome so overwhelming, so magnificent, so undeniably the work of God's hand, then Rome itself would be the argument. Pilgrims would arrive skeptical and leave converted, not by words, by stone and light and space. See, the popes of the 17th century understood something that modern politicians still struggle to grasp, that cities are not just places to live. They are statements of belief. They are arguments made in marble. Rome in 1600 was not making that argument. The streets were crooked and medieval. The great basilicas were unfinished or in disrepair. There was no coherent urban plan, no grand axis, no sense of a city that believed in itself. That was about to change. And the man who started the transformation had been dead for 15 years before Bernini ever picked up a chisel. His name was Pope Sixtus V. He reigned for only 5 years, 1585 to 1590. In that time, he did more to reshape Rome than any ruler in 1,000 years. Sixtus V had a vision that was radical in its simplicity. Rome was a pilgrimage city. Every year, hundreds of thousands of faithful walked its streets visiting sacred sites. But those streets were a labyrinth. Pilgrims got lost. They moved through darkness and confusion. The city offered no sense of divine order. Sixtus V imposed that order by force. He cut 6 straight boulevards through the medieval tangle of Rome, wide, direct roads connecting the major basilicas. He moved ancient Egyptian obelisks, brought to Rome centuries earlier as trophies of empire, and placed them at the intersections of these new roads. They served as navigation points, visible from a distance marking the sacred destinations. See, he restored the ancient Aqua Felice aqueduct, bringing clean water back to the hills of Rome for the first time in over 1,000 years. Fountains appeared where there had been dust. In 5 years, Sixtus V gave Rome a skeleton. He couldn't finish the body. He died before his vision was complete, but the bones were there. The straight lines, the water, the obelisks pointing toward heaven like stone fingers. The next generation of popes inherited a city with a plan, or what they needed was an artist capable of fulfilling it. In 1623, a new pope took the throne. His name was Maffeo Barberini. He would reign as Urban VIII for 21 years. And within weeks of his election, he summoned a 25-year-old sculptor who had been the talk of Rome since he was 10 years old. His name was Gian Lorenzo Bernini. Bernini was not a normal artist. He was a phenomenon. Born in Naples in 1598, he had moved to Rome as a child with his father. He, a sculptor of modest talent who immediately recognized that his son possessed something he could never teach. By age 15, Bernini was producing work that older masters claimed was impossible for someone his age. By 20, his marble sculptures, Apollo and Daphne, the rape of Proserpina, David, were being discussed across Europe as miracles of technique. He didn't carve marble, he persuaded it to become something else: skin, hair, water, wind. A Pope Urban VIII reportedly told him, "It is your great fortune, Cavaliere, to see Maffeo Barberini Pope, but our fortune is far greater, to have Bernini alive in our pontificate." The commission that would define both their legacies was the baldachin over the tomb of St. Peter. The interior of St. Peter's Basilica, the largest church in the world, then still under construction, needed a canopy marking the spot where, according to tradition, the Apostle Peter was buried. Bernini designed something that had never existed: a bronze canopy 95 feet high, its 4 twisted columns spiraling upward like living things, its top a crown of bronze flames and a golden orb. The bronze came partly from the Pantheon's ancient portico. Stripped, melted, reborn. It took 11 years to build. When it was unveiled in 1633, visitors wept. But Bernini was just beginning. In the 1640s, commissioned by Pope Innocent X, a different pope, the one who initially distrusted him, Bernini created the Fontana dei Quattro Fiumi in the Piazza Navona. 4 colossal river gods representing the Nile, the Ganges, the Danube, and the Rio de la Plata, the 4 known continents, erupted from a rocky cliff around an ancient Egyptian obelisk. Water cascaded between them. The whole composition moved, breathed, roared. Rome had never seen anything like it. The city was becoming a theater, and Bernini was its director. But Bernini was not alone. Working in the same city, in the same decades, was a man his polar opposite in temperament, background, and vision. His name was Francesco Borromini, and the tension between these two men, solar versus shadow, extrovert versus tormented introvert, produced the most concentrated explosion of architectural genius any city has ever witnessed. Borromini was born in northern Italy in 1599, 1 year after Bernini. He came to Rome as a teenager to work as a stonemason, learning his craft with his hands before he learned it with his mind. He worked under Carlo Maderno on St. Peter's. He worked briefly under Bernini himself, a subordinate relationship that left permanent scars on both men. Where Bernini was theatrical, social, beloved by popes, Borromini was solitary, difficult, consumed by geometry. He saw architecture not as decoration but as mathematics made physical. He bent walls into curves. He twisted spires into spirals. He designed spaces that seemed to breathe, to expand and contract with the movement of light. His first independent masterpiece, San Carlo alle Quattro Fontane, was finished in 1641. It was tiny. The church's entire floor plan fits inside one of the piers supporting the dome of St. Peter's. But inside, the walls undulated in a continuous flowing curve, the dome above pierced by hidden windows, so that light seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. Architects still study it. No one has quite explained how he made a small room feel infinite. His Santivo alla Sapienza twisted its dome into a spiral that had no precedent in architectural history and has had no true successor since. The two men despised each other. Borromini accused Bernini of stealing his ideas. Bernini used his papal connections to sideline Borromini from the great commissions. The rivalry was bitter, personal, and completely productive for the city that hosted it. Because of their competition, Rome got twice the genius. By 1660, the city was unrecognizable from what it had been 60 years before. New churches rose on every block. Piazzas were carved out of the medieval fabric. fountains sang at every crossroads. Visitors from across Europe made the journey not just as pilgrims, but as students, to see what was being built, to understand what was possible. Rome had become the school of the world, and then Bernini built the thing that completed everything. In 1656, Pope Alexander VII gave him the commission that would define his legacy and transform the approach to St. Peter's Basilica forever. The problem was simple to state and almost impossible to solve. How do you create a space in front of the largest church in the world that prepares the visitor for what they are about to experience? How do you make someone feel before they even enter the embrace of the universal church? Bernini's solution was the colonnade. Two sweeping curved arms, each a quadruple row of columns reaching out from the facade of St. Peter's and wrapping around an immense oval piazza. 284 columns, 88 pilasters, 140 statues of saints on the roofline, arms raised, gazing down at the crowd below. The effect was, and remains, unlike anything else in the world. Standing at the center of the piazza, you are simultaneously in the open air and enclosed. The colonnade surrounds you but does not trap you. The sky is above, but the saints are watching. The basilica ahead is vast, but the space before it does not crush. It welcomes. Bernini described it himself. The Church of St. Peter's, as the mother of all churches, had to have a colonnade that would receive Catholics to reaffirm their faith, heretics to reunite them with the Church, and infidels to enlighten them with the true faith. It took 11 years to build. It was completed in 1667. Bernini was 68 years old. When Alexander VII walked through the colonnade for the first time and saw the full effect, he reportedly stood in silence for a long moment. Then he said, "This is not architecture, this is an act of faith." The medieval city of 1600 was gone. In its place stood something new, a city that had decided consciously and at enormous cost to become the most beautiful place on earth in order to prove a point about the nature of God. Whether you believe that point or not, the beauty remains. By 1700, Rome had been transformed beyond recognition. The population had grown from 100,000 to nearly 150,000. More importantly, the city received hundreds of thousands of visitors every year. Pilgrims, artists, architects, nobles completing their grand tour of Europe. Every serious artist on the continent made the journey to Rome to study what Bernini and Borromini had built. The city had become the mandatory education for anyone who wanted to understand what architecture and sculpture could achieve. The influence spread everywhere the Catholic Church had reach. In Brazil, the baroque churches of Salvador and Ouro Preto echo the twisted columns and dramatic light of Rome's Counter-Reformation. In Mexico, the facades of colonial cathedrals repeat the vocabulary Borromini invented in streets barely wide enough for two horses. In the Philippines, in Peru, in Portugal, or in Poland, everywhere Catholicism went, Roman Baroque followed. A visual language invented in one city over 1 century colonized half the world's sacred architecture. The rivalry between Bernini and Borromini left a mark beyond Rome as well. Bernini's theatrical, emotional approach to space influenced every grand public architecture that followed, from the Palace of Versailles to the design of Washington, D.C. Borromini's geometric innovations would not be fully understood until the 20th century, when architects finally had the mathematical tools to analyze what he had done intuitively. Walk through Rome today and you are walking through the 17th century. The Piazza Navona, the Trevi Fountain completed in Bernini's tradition, the Piazza del Popolo, the Via del Corso, the Colonnade of St. Peter's, unchanged since 1667. The popes who commissioned this transformation believed they were building the city of God on earth. They believed beauty was an argument for faith that no theological treatise could match. They were not wrong about the beauty. We tend to think of cities as practical things. Infrastructure, housing, commerce. Rome in the 17th century suggests something different, that a city can be an act of will, that the decision to make something beautiful, genuinely, overwhelmingly, be unreasonably beautiful, can change how millions of people across centuries understand what human beings are capable of. Bernini and Borromini were rivals who never reconciled, but the city they built together is the most persuasive argument either of them ever made. If this reconstruction moved you, hit the like button and subscribe. We rebuild lost worlds every week. Next episode, we go to a city that rose from total destruction to become the symbol of an empire. Thanks for watching.